These helicopter pilots made some mistakes and they ended up destroying 2 helicopters, and this could have easily been prevented. And in this video, I'm going to show you what mistakes they made and how all it took was a few minor oversights to cause this catastrophic collision. My name is Hoover and welcome to your pilot debrief. This incident took place at the Pasadena Police Department located just outside of LA, about 1.5 miles north of the Rose Bowl Stadium. This is the video provided by the NTSB, and if you pay attention to the left-hand side of the screen here, you're going to see a couple of individuals pulling a helicopter out of the hangar to get it ready for takeoff. Now this helicopter had just undergone maintenance, but it's about to launch in response to a priority burglary call. The pilot's name is Mark. He's 40 years old and he has over 13,000 hours of flight time with about 725 hours in this make and model. The other helicopter that you don't see in the video right now is being flown by Carol, and she's going to crash into Mark in just a few minutes. Carol is 49 years old and she has 16,000 hours of flight time, including over 8,000 hours flying this type of helicopter. So Carol definitely has a tremendous amount of experience, but as we've seen in a lot of my other videos, regardless of how many hours you have, you can still make pretty big mistakes. If we take a look at the full NTSB report, we can see this image of the heliport showing the location of pad 1 over here on the right. You've got pad 2 in the center, and then the touchdown and liftoff area over here on the left. And we're going to take a closer look at this later and how this design played a role in the crash. But for now, the most important thing that you need to know about this heliport is that according to the NTSB investigation, back in 1973, it was designated under the classification of public safety agencies, and thus it would be exempt from the Department of Aeronautics heliport regulations. This meant that for almost 40 years leading up to the crash, these police helicopters were able to operate with certain freedoms because they were exempt from many of the stricter regulations that were imposed on newer heliport facilities over the years. Unfortunately, this exemption was originally intended to be a benefit, but it would prove to be a large contributing factor to the crash. As we go back to the video, you can see that Mark is busy doing his pre-flight and getting ready to go, but the weather is overcast and it's starting to rain. What Mark doesn't realize is the holes in the Swiss cheese model are starting to line up, and he's now one step closer to being involved in this collision. And that's because Carol had taken off only about 3 minutes prior to Mark pulling his helicopter out of the hangar. You see, Mark had assumed that Carol was going to be gone for about an hour providing traffic support for the Rose Bowl, so he wasn't expecting her to come back anytime soon. If you're not familiar with the Swiss cheese model in aviation, basically each slice of Swiss cheese is like a barrier that stops a hazard and prevents a mishap. The more slices of cheese that you have, the less likely a threat is going to make it all the way through. Now, each of those holes might be completely unrelated and they don't necessarily pose a threat when viewed individually, but if they all line up perfectly, then that's when bad things usually happen. When it comes to this crash, the next hole in the Swiss cheese that's lining up is Mark doesn't realize that the weather is getting worse and Carol has already started her return to base. Normally this wouldn't be a big deal, but the problem is there's no Unicom frequency for this heliport. And that basically means there's no one on the ground using a radio to monitor what's going on with the helicopters or provide them with traffic advisories. This is a huge problem because the only way that anyone on the ground at the police station knows if a helicopter is coming back is if they either go out and start up another helicopter and turn on the radio, or typically what they do is they just walk outside and they hear it approaching for landing. This is a huge flaw in their procedures, but because of their exemption from the regulations, this is the way they've been doing it for almost 40 years without a single incident. And one of the reasons for this is because the pilots are still required to make radio calls when they're taking off or landing, so that way they can at least coordinate with each other to avoid a collision. And technically, according to the investigation, when Carol was flying back to base, she said that she broadcast her position per protocol. And while she's doing that, Mark is looking at the weather, but he figured that if Carol was flying, then it must be good enough. So his plan was to get airborne as soon as possible, and then he was going to call her on the radios to get an update on the weather. The only problem with that plan is that even though he's already started up, he doesn't have his radio turned on, so they have no way to talk to each other. Now, if we go back and look at this image from the investigation, you've got Carol coming into land where the touchdown and liftoff area is over here on the left. And then her plan is to hover taxi over to pad 2. And then you've got pad 1 over on the right where Mark is at. And then it's kind of hard to tell in this image, but these things over here on the right hand side are fuel pumps. You can see them a lot more clearly in the video right here, and these are also going to play a role in the crash. It's also kind of hard to see, but there's a small yellow box right here in pad 2, and that's the spot where Carol is supposed to park. Now you can see that it's not directly in the center of pad 2 because they've got it offset from the touchdown and liftoff area. And that means that the center of this yellow box is only 37 feet from the center of pad 1. And Carol and Mark are flying OH-58s, and those have a rotor diameter of 35 feet. So if they're both running engines at the same time, then there's only a few feet of margin for error between them. And keep in mind that as risky as that sounds, remember, they've been operating like this for decades without a problem. Now, if we go back to the video, there's two things that I want you to pay close attention to. The first is that you're going to see a guy coming out of the trailer or this building back here to the right behind Mark. And the other is you're going to see a black dot in the top left corner over here that it's going to get bigger because that's Carol flying her approach. As Carol makes her approach, she said that she overflew the area and she saw the outline of Mark's helo on pad 1, but she wasn't sure if the main rotor blades were turning or not. She continued the approach and radioed her intention and location, but received no response from anyone. So you can see how the fact that they don't have a Unicom frequency to tell Carol what's going on, and the fact that she doesn't get a response on the radio, essentially is leading her to assume that there's no one in Mark's helicopter, or at least if there is someone in the helicopter, then they haven't started up yet, so there's no risk to her. And I think right now she's just really focused more on trying to land because of the rain reducing her visibility. The other issue right now that you can see in the video is that Mark's got the engine running, so he never hears the sound of Carol's helicopter making the approach to land, and if that's not enough, here comes the man from the trailer. This guy is the air support lieutenant, and he saw that the weather was deteriorating, so he decided to walk out and tell Mark to stand down, and he actually saw Carol making her approach to land, but he didn't really think anything about it. And do you see what's going on right now? All the holes in the Swiss cheese are almost lined up because at the exact same time that Carol has turned to maneuver to pad 2, that air support lieutenant is at the door trying to tell Mark to shut down, and no one is paying attention to what Carol is doing. Watch what happens as Carol makes her final turn to park, and then I'm going to explain the biggest mistake that both these pilots made and what happened after the crash. I'll show the rest of the video in a second, but first, Mark's biggest mistake is another hole in our Swiss cheese model, and you can see it in this image of the wreckage. His helicopter wasn't parked inside the yellow box on pad 1 where it was supposed to be, and he said the reason was because he knew he would be airborne in just a few minutes, and Carol wasn't coming back soon. And he also said this was a common practice that other pilots would do because of poor water drainage on the pad and because of how close the fuel pumps are. However, according to Carol, in all her years of flying there, she had never parked outside of the box, and she hadn't seen any other pilots do that either. And in my opinion, Carol's biggest mistake was trying to rush this landing when there was no need to. Regardless of the mistakes that both pilots made, if the heliport had actually followed the regulations over the years, this whole incident probably never would have happened, and this is what it looks like today after they redesigned the entire heliport following this crash. And if you learned something from this pilot debrief, then be sure to watch another one on the channel, and I'll see you next time.